Hello and welcome to the Disciple Making Podcast, where we're all about helping Christians to become disciple makers. I'm your host, Brad Mann, and today we are going to continue our conversation on foundations and establishing the right foundations in our lives and the lives of those that we're discipling, and we're talking about what it looks like to live in obedience to the kingdom agenda. And so I'm really excited to welcome a very good friend of mine and colleague, Roland. Roland is one of the pastors at Connect Church with me, and Rolls, it's really awesome to have you on the podcast today.
Hey, Braddles. I call you Braddles instead of Brad. You call me Rolls.
True story.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me. And how's it to your listeners? It's good to be together.
Awesome. Thanks, Rolls. So good to be. I've been waiting to bring Rolls onto the podcast for a long time now, so I'm excited that we can get it in today.
Yeah, it's about time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rolls, we're talking about obedience to the kingdom agenda, and remember a little while ago, you and I were having a discussion about just the nature of the gospel, and we were talking about what the gospel looks like and what the gospel is comprised of, and sort of since that time, we've both kind of been on a bit of a journey in terms of the nature of what the gospel is. So, and, over the last 2 weeks in the podcast, we've been talking a bit about that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey in understanding the gospel in light of the kingdom?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's been quite an exciting journey. I think, coming to know the Lord about 15 years ago, I was taught that the gospel was about being saved.
Yeah,
it's about the price Jesus paid for you on the cross, that your sins were covered because of his blood.
Yeah.
And we could be redeemed and forgiven and inherit eternity because of what he had done for us.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of the gospel. And I say part because a lot of us have made it the core of the gospel. And so my journey has been in understanding what the core of the gospel really is. And to keep it brief and succinct, I've come to a place where I realize the core of the gospel, the center of the gospel is Jesus and the fact that he is king. And part of that story and part of the good news is that because he is king, he was the one able to redeem us and to pay the price that was necessary for our salvation. And so it's a bit of a revelation for me, understanding something that I thought I'd understood completely, and one of the dangers of making salvation the core of the gospel is it makes it all about us, and it truncates the gospel in the sense that it cuts it short. And if we focus just on salvation, we miss the story of Jesus, Old Testament build up to the New Testament covenant, and we miss, I think, a lot of what we're supposed to be getting.
Yeah.
Jesus as king is the center. The fact that the Messiah has come, that's the good news.
That's the news, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, Rolls, I love what you said there. I mean, there's two things that we could branch into, and I'm going to leave the one on the side because the connection to the Old Testament and the gospel is, we could preach a great sermon on that in and of itself. But just the other thing that I think is so significant and so ties into the concept of the obedience to the kingdom agenda is when we get the gospel wrong, when the gospel is about our salvation, then Jesus becomes about serving us.
Yes.
And that's something that we have noticed. I know we've had a number of conversations, just as you look at the church in general, and often the Western church, that's a kind of prevalent attitude that you kind of see, or culture that sifts through many of the churches that exist at the moment.
Yeah, and then it also almost like Jesus becomes a means to an end, doesn't he? It's like he's there to serve a purpose. The purpose is my salvation. And once I'm saved, and once that purpose is fulfilled, we tend to put Jesus on the back burner. And almost he remains a backstory, whereas he is the story.
Yeah. Yeah. And he becomes like a flavor that we add to our lives and the things that we do, but is often not the center.
Sure. Yeah.
Because he's there to serve us rather than we're being there to serve him.
Yeah. And I think there's some understanding or buy-in from us that we need to serve him and now have our lives changed. Our lives do need to look different.
Yes.
But if we preach salvation at the center of the gospel, our salvation remains at the center, and obedience to Jesus is not a significant player necessarily in our lives. We don't focus on, we don't quite understand why obedience is so significant. But when we understand Jesus as king and him being at the center of the gospel, and we actually live in a monarchy as opposed to a democracy, obedience then becomes incredibly important, and we begin to understand the significance of obedience. Which is incredibly important.
Yeah, it really is. And for me, that's one of those markers. And when we pick that up, that Jesus is the king and the king kind of sets the rules.
Yeah.
That for me has been one of the biggest things that shaped my theology as you try and reason through and work out, what we believe about different things. There's been many times we've been in discussions where you're I really want to believe something else. I feel like I wish Scripture would teach this more progressive idea.
Yeah, I wish it would unpack it a bit more.
Yeah.
Wish it would be a little bit more detailed, a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe give us a little bit more leeway in this area or that area. And because it's about the king and what the king has set up, it creates for us this framework where what the king says kind of goes.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people miss that because we want to make Christianity work for us. And working for us means as little not compromise is the wrong word, as little cost as possible for us. Yeah. We want to make it as easy as possible and shape where we can and chisel where we can the perfect flavor for us of Christianity. And when obedience is brought into it, uncompromising obedience, it becomes a little bit uncomfortable because we have to do the things the king calls us to do. Yeah. And our human tendency and nature tends towards rebelling against authority. We don't like authority structures. Yeah, absolutely. And I think often obedience is associated with something negative as opposed to something positive. But I think it's important that we get a godly perspective and a kingdom perspective on how beautiful obedience actually is.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's something I envy in Roland's life compared to my own roles as a dad, to two wonderful children.
Going to be three,
which is really exciting. I was going to leave you to share that on the podcast.
Yeah, no, three, third one's on its way.
Which is really exciting. And so as a dad, you want to lead your family and you want to lead your kids. And so you can, with your wife, set the rules for your home. And those aren't always well received by your kids.
Yeah.
I'm assuming.
Certainly not. Yeah, especially when it comes to sweets and bedtime.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time I see them on reasonably good behavior. But I know that's not always the case.
No, most certainly not. I think when they are on good behavior, it's God's grace. And when they're ill-disciplined, it's a parenting failure on our part. But we're blessed and they're good children.
But it's that helpful analogy where as a father, you set boundaries for your children because you know what's good for them, because you want to raise them up to be the men and women that God has created them to be. And so you call them to obedience in certain ways, in ways they don't always understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of setting up structures in my family and in our lives for our children and for ourselves is not only about making sure we don't do the things we're not supposed to because it would be dangerous and doing the things we are supposed to because it would be beneficial. It's also about a love language. I think obedience is a love language. Most certainly with God, it's a love language. You know? So we big time into love languages as a culture. There's that book, The 5 Love Languages, and I don't know what they all are, but it's like one is gifts, one is words of affirmation, the other one's touch,
acts of service,
quality
time. There we go.
And time. Time. There we go. All right. So, and I certainly don't think that's an exhaustive list, but it certainly is a full list. It's a good one.
Helpful descriptors. Yeah.
I think for the Lord, obedience is his love language, and we miss that. I was just looking at some scriptures before I came. I knew we were going to be chatting about this, and if there was just one scripture that I'd point people to help understand that this is actually a love language for the Lord, it's John chapter 14, verse 15. Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commands.
Yeah.
Right? It's just very simple. You can't manipulate that to mean anything else. Jesus says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And God loves obedience, not because he loves seeing you do what he's told you to do. I think that's part of it. But in obedience, you display your love and affection for him and your trust in him to give you stuff to do that would benefit you and allows you to be part of something that's far bigger than you, and that's his kingdom.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I remember a number of years ago, I think I was still at seminary at the time, and I remember someone shared this Christian little video composition with me. It was done by Francis Chan, and it so unpacked for me what we as Christians often like. And it's this little 3-minute video or clip or whatever, and Francis Chan starts and he's like, you know what, sometimes imagine I tell my daughter to go and clean her room, and she comes back to me and she's like, you know what, Dad, I thought about what you said, And I've decided that a group of us are going to get together every week, and we're going to talk about what it would look like if I clean my room.
Yes.
And then she comes back a few weeks later and she says, you know what, Dad, what we've done is we've actually gone back and we've studied the original language of the words that you used when you told us to go and to clean our room. And we feel like we really understand the nuances and the significance of the different aspects of what it means to clean our room. And we really know what our room would look like if it was clean.
Yeah.
And Franz, he spends 3 minutes kind of drawing this long story out. And he's like, actually, all I wanted her to do was clean her room.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the point of his story is we seem to have this tendency as Christians, and I've certainly seen it. I've seen it in myself, and I've seen it in our church, and I've seen it in many churches where it's easier to grow in knowledge than it is to grow in obedience.
Yes. Yeah. It is definitely easier to do that because gaining knowledge, apart from requiring a bit of your time and effort to study, doesn't really require much else of you.
Yeah.
Whereas obedience requires you to put yourself out there and possibly into uncomfortable and even dangerous situations for the kingdom.
Yeah.
But without obedience, no one grows. Yeah. Nothing happens. And I think even what you're doing here, just, listening to this podcast, I realize that there's so many people who probably tune in on a regular basis and are incredibly blessed by it. If you weren't obedient, if you weren't obedient to God's call on your life and the prompting of the Lord to do this, people listening wouldn't be blessed. You wouldn't be growing in yourself, because I'm sure this requires a lot of challenge and thought and effort to actually put this together. So it's you and the Lord that is now a significant part of what you do, preparing for this. It's people listening that are being blessed. And if you didn't action what you knew God had called you to do, you just had knowledge of what God wanted you to do, we would be sitting here having coffee, talking about maybe significant stuff and not really recording it.
Yeah.
And I think God's intention was for you to have an impact beyond your lounge. You know?
Absolutely.
And like for me, that really strikes at the heart of what we're meant to be doing as Christians. I mean, Jesus says in Matthew 28, and I'm sure Brad shared this so often, but Brad likes to use big words, and one of the words he taught me about was superlative.
Yeah, come on.
and Jesus does. He gives a superlative command. In other words, a command that sort of like trumps all other commands and encapsulates all other commands. And the command in Matthew chapter 28 says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Like go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this is what is very significant for us in our chat today.
Yeah.
He says, go and make disciples and teach them to obey all that I've commanded you to do.
Yeah.
Part of the Great Commission, the thing that Jesus wants us to do and not just think about, is to teach people to be obedient, because obedience produces kingdom fruit.
Yeah, I love that.
Right? Yeah, and I think that's it. You've been obedient to God. There have been times in our lives where we've been obedient to God and we've seen incredible fruit. And then we've been times where we've been disobedient and we haven't been able to step into the blessing. We haven't been able to get from God or do for God what He called us to do. And honestly, in my life, those times have left me feeling a little bit empty, rebuked, guilty. And I've had to work through that. And I've come to a place where I realize like obedience is incredibly significant, not only for my own peace and joy, but because the kingdom requires God's people to be obedient.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense. I think I've spoken a lot and used a lot of words, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean Christians that aren't, you can't be a Christian and not be obedient.
No.
That's the essence. And we're not talking the doctrine of salvation here. We're just saying like if Jesus has said, if you love me, you will obey my commandments.
Yes.
Then if we're not living with an obedient lifestyle and an obedient heart, then we're never gonna actually love Jesus.
Yeah, and I think also just to clarify, like that's not perfect obedience, because only Jesus was perfectly obedient.
100%.
I think it means that the atmosphere of your life tends towards obedience.
Yes.
And like in my home, we go back to the family analogy. My children are more often than not obedient and well-behaved and beautiful children and such blessings.
Absolutely.
And there are times when they're disobedient. That doesn't make me love them less. It just makes them a disobedient child in that moment. They know I'm their father. They know Mandy's their mother. They know they're part of the family, that they're well-loved, but that they'll get disciplined if they're disobedient. Yeah. Most of the time there's obedience, but there will be times where there's disobedience. And I think that's true for us as Christians. We will be disobedient at times. It's sinful nature, it's our flesh, it's the enemy who's at work, and we give in to sometimes his temptations and stuff like that. But that cannot be the atmosphere of our lives. As a Christian, the atmosphere of your life needs to be and needs to tend towards obedience to Jesus more often than not. That's the fruit of your life. I mean, the book of James is all about that, putting your faith into action.
That's it.
When you're obedient, your faith works. It works itself out. And the fruit of your life is evident in the way that you are obeying Jesus. So I 100% agree. There's no such thing as a Christian that isn't obedient to the Lord.
So, Ross, this is let's take the last section of the podcast here, because I think that's just so spot on, and we all just need to hear that. But let's talk a little bit. Maybe you got some stories of times where God has stretched you in obedience. Maybe there might be some fun stories to share there. Maybe there's some stories you can share with us about what God has begun to do in you to cultivate that atmosphere and that heart attitude of obedience to the Lord.
Yeah, so let me start off with one of the biggest ones. It was basically my call to the church that I'm currently at, Connect Church.
Yeah.
Leaving, I was born and bred in East London.
We have lots of in-house jokes about Roland coming from
the Eastern Cape. Yeah, if you're listening to this and you're not a South African, don't worry. Yeah.
Go visit the Eastern Cape.
Go visit the Eastern Cape if you come to South Africa. But if you're South African, you know that the Eastern Cape is the best province around. And Cape Townians like to call Cape Town or the Western Cape the Promised Land. And to be honest, it is a land that God called us to. And I think on a serious note, that was part of my wrestle, leaving East London, the city where I was born, leaving the province that I grew up in, and leaving behind all my family and friends that I'd made and that I'd spent my whole life with. It was a significant move. To be honest, I didn't want to come. There was a huge inner wrestle, emotional, spiritual wrestle that I had, trying to come to terms with what I knew God was calling me to do, but what I didn't want to do.
Right.
And in many ways felt like a Jonah and wanted to run away. There was a bit of excitement. I can't lie and say that there wasn't some eager anticipation to dive into something new and experience something new, but most of my feelings were feelings of wanting to stay, wanting to run away, wanting to pretend that this never actually happened, you know. And it took me some time to work through that, but I realized that I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. If I stayed, I would never be able to say to anybody that I ever discipled again, you need to be obedient to the Lord because that's what God has called us to do.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because if I stayed, I knew I would have been being disobedient. And by saying yes, I had peace knowing that I was being obedient to God, but I had to face the challenges that came with being obedient. And so obviously I'm here now and I've been here. This is my 11th year. And I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed in East London, but what I do know is I wouldn't have experienced all the things I've experienced now. And God has grown me in so many ways that I know are only as a result of this season. And God has been so faithful and God has been so close in ways that I'd never experienced before. And I believe that that's as a result of being obedient, right? And I've learned so much stuff as a result of leaving and coming and being on my own and having God carve me and shape me, you know, through the experiences that I've had here. It's been a fantastic experience. And I think that was one of the biggest obedience moments of my life, you know. The other one was a call to full-time ministry. The Lord, you know, opened the door for me to make a decision to either go and work for my father, who owns a plumbing company, or to step into full-time ministry and give up the job that I had. And he spoke very clearly to me there. I made that decision. It was a much easier decision to make, but it was an obedient step. And every single step after that was a lot easier because God just opened doors, you know. And I found that that's really something guys listening need to understand, that when you're obedient to God, God keeps opening the right doors at the right time for you. And it never really becomes much of a struggle to achieve what God has called you to because you're walking in step with him, if that makes sense. It's not that it's not difficult and it's not challenging. It's that there's this inner peace and this joy, and you just see God opening up doors that you know that you couldn't have opened up by yourself. And that's as a result of him blessing you and making sure that you're staying in step and achieve for him what he's called you to achieve.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll share a story from my side that's less dramatic in terms of the life orientation. You know, it didn't turn my life around a corner to move to another city or do something major. But I remember there was a time where in our young adult body at church, we did a thing that has been called by some spiritual treasure hunting. So at the risk of offending some people who think that's very, very weird, just bear with me, and I'll share this little story quickly. But so we gathered together as a bunch of Christians, and we took some time, and the plan was we're going to pray, and we're going to ask God, won't you tell us where we should go, and won't you show us the people you want us to speak to when we get to this place? Because we wanted to do evangelism. That was the heart of what we wanted to do. And so we took some time and we prayed together. And so we felt we needed to go to one of the local shopping centers in our city. So we had the shopping center. And then it was, okay, God, well, who do we need to speak to when we're there? And so in my mind, I saw this picture of a Muslim man wearing the hats that the guys wear. You should probably know what it's called.
Turban.
Not a turban.
It's not called turban.
No.
I know that ladies wear something called a burqa.
Yeah, not a burqa, just the little hat that goes on top. And anyway, so
for
that's
Jewish people, it's called a yarmulke.
Yes, for Jewish people, it's a yarmulke. I don't know what it is.
It's one of those things. We know what Brad is talking about.
Okay. Anyway, so that's all I had. I had Muslim guy, and I saw this image from the back of this guy with this little thing on his head. And so now I'm like, wonderful. Lord, it's a way to set the bar low, like let's go for someone in another religion that is antithetical to what I believe. Awesome. I'm really excited. Sarcasm. I wasn't very excited. I was petrified. Off we go, and we wander around the shopping center, and lo and behold, after being there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, I'm going up the escalator, and I see this guy, 7, 8 people in front of me, and he's a Muslim guy. He's wearing this thing on his head. I'm like, okay, I guess I got to go talk to him now. Now it's time to be obedient. So off we go, and I go and I kind of introduce myself, and it's all real awkward. It's like, hi, my name's Brad. I'm a Christian. I was praying earlier. Felt like God wanted me to speak to you, and he's obviously like, this guy's off the wall, and this is all weird. But anyway, so we begin to chat, and it turns out, as I was chatting to this guy, he had been hiding in the men's bathroom for hours, waiting for someone to come in singing a Christian song, so that he could ask them about Jesus. And here I was having this conversation with him because God had really led me to him. And it was amazing for me. It was this moments of incredible, just affirmation. Like when we were obedient, like God really is at work. And disclaimer, there were a number of other times we went out and they weren't all as glorious as that. Some of them were just good. Some of them were okay. And some of them, the old ladies chased me away with a brick in her bag,
But see, and I think this is the thing, sorry to interrupt you. I think we're always looking for testimonies of people who are obedient and something good happened.
Yeah.
But I think obedience in and of itself is a growth experience.
Absolutely.
So I think a very positive testimony is a testimony where someone has said, look, I feel God has called me to go out and minister to people and pray for them. And as they've done that, they've been rebuked, they've been chastised, they've been
put
down, mocked and teased. Yeah. We often don't have Christians sharing those stories because we feel like we failed. No, you didn't fail. People rejected the message that you had and what God had called you to bring, and that's going to happen. You were successful in being obedient to God.
Yeah.
And we always talk about living for an audience of one. I think that really is important for us to understand. We're called to be a kingdom community and to love people, but you're really doing it for the King.
Yeah.
And so even stories where you failed are actually success stories.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, that's a really good point, Rolls, because I was once a river guide before I was a pastor, and I was saved when I was 18 years old, and I wasn't a very sexually adventurous 18-year-old, and I had a basic Christian background, and so for whatever reason, I was a virgin until I got married, and half of that reason is the Lord, because once I started following Jesus, that was my decision. And half of that was the collective decision of society before that to deny me that opportunity.
I don't know. Deny you. I think it was such a...
Let's call it the Lord. Right?
We need to have a separate conversation about this.
Anyway.
The Lord spared you in His grace.
I know, and it was beautiful.
Yeah.
But it was like for a good number of years of my life, that was a physical choice that I was making because that's what and this is part of the kingdom agenda that we're talking about. When you're talking about obedience, it's not just when God speaks directly, but also what is the agenda of the kingdom. And for us as Christians, part of that means doing our best to remain celibate until we're married. That's what the King desires. And so that was where I was. And I remember one day on the side of the river, as river guides, a conversation started. And however it came out that I was still a virgin. And I remember guys literally rolling on the floor laughing at me because it was so inconceivable to them that was the case.
Yeah.
And I got mocked. I got mocked hard. Not by a bunch of random people, but by people that I knew, people that I worked with, people that I considered friends. That was a really hard moment. And yet it was worth it for the sake of the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only for the sake of the kingdom, but for your marriage.
Yeah.
And so
100%.
what you brought into your marriage now is not what many people are able to bring into their marriage. And that's purity, it's innocence, and it's an ability to give yourself to your partner for the first time in marriage, the way God designed it, which carries with it and brings with it its own benefits and blessings.
Yeah.
You know, and no matter how much mockery you had to endure, God's never outdone by the things of this world and by ungodliness. And so what he blesses you with far outweighs what you had to endure for the sake of obedience. You know, and just if I can pick up quickly on your story of the Muslim guy that you ministered to, I think what's important there is your growth and your encouragement from having heard the Lord and then being brave enough to step out. That growth is important, but I think what's even more significant is the fact that if you hadn't have done that, sure, God could have used anybody else to minister to that guy, but in that moment, someone needed to hear from the Lord and was waiting and trusting on the Lord to provide an intimate encounter like that. And God did, and you were obedient. The question I have is, what would have happened had you not been obedient?
It's a great question, Ross.
We can make ourselves feel better and say, well, someone else would have done it. And maybe that's true, but you don't know. And you're always left going, well, what happens if?
Yeah.
Right? The key is you were asked by God in that moment to do it, and you did it, and something significant happened. Yeah. And someone's eternity was impacted. And I think this is where the significance and the seriousness of obedience comes in. Like, it's not just for us and our growth, although that's part of it. We're talking eternities here. You know, I was just saying to Brad the other day over coffee, you know, we're having to deal with corona and vaccines and all this other stuff, and people on this side of the fence and people on that side of the fence, and people very heated about their opinions and their perspectives about whether you should get vaccinated and shouldn't get vaccinated. I don't want to comment on that because that's not what this is about. What I want to say, though, is there's something far more dangerous than the coronavirus out there, and that's sin. Yeah. You know, and Christians are sharing so many opinions and perspectives about different things, politically, socially, culturally. But we need to get fired up for the gospel again. Amen. We need to get fired up for obedience to Jesus again, because obedience to Jesus leads to life. Yeah, right, and that's I think the most important thing we need to be concerned with at this point in time. In fact, for the rest of our lives, it's obedience to the kingdom agenda, because that saves souls. Yeah,
absolutely. So, Roz, I think that's so good. We are coming to the end of our time. So as we draw this to an end, I'll give you just an opportunity to share one or two short insights on that. How would you want to encourage guys to cultivate that culture of obedience in their life?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think I just need to share with people what I've experienced in my own life and what's helped for me. I think, like many people, I tend to want to do things and do things well and dive headlong into it and be achieving fantastic stuff for God. You know, when I give my mind to something, I want to do it to the best of my ability, and I go like, you know, all in.
Very true. I've seen this in Roland in multiple areas.
It's true. But what tends to happen then is we place unrealistic expectations on ourselves, and we get frustrated, and we become our own worst enemies and our own worst critics, you know. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a bit of self-evaluation and introspection, but I think we can sometimes beat ourselves up over nothing. I would say for the young Christian, or for the Christian who's been walking with the Lord for a while, but you've been being disobedient, and you just like really convicted, and you're going, yes, actually, I want to be an obedient Christian. I actually want obedience to the King to be the atmosphere of my life. I would say it's okay to say to you to start small. Yeah. So for me, it's just been making sure that when I wake up, or sometime during the day, even before I go to bed, I have what I call coffee with God. And it's 5 minutes with the Lord, asking the Lord to speak to me, asking the Lord to give me an agenda for the day. Sometimes I hear from the Lord, sometimes I don't. If I don't hear from the Lord and the day, you know, I feel like gets wasted or nothing really significant happened, at least I started my day with obedience to the Lord by spending time with Him.
That's good, yeah.
As you start to do that, practically, it encourages you because you've stuck to something that you know God has called you to do. But as you start to do it, I can guarantee you God will start to drop thoughts and ideas into your heart and into your mind. Then you need to take the next step and go, right, I've had coffee with God. Let me see how this works itself out, and talk to somebody about what God has said to you. Put it out there so that you're held accountable.
Yeah,
right.
That's good.
And then make sure that you start to action whatever you can to be obedient to what God has called you to be obedient to. And you'll begin to see doors open and you being used for significant stuff that ordinarily wouldn't have happened had you not started with that coffee with God. So it all starts with that. I call it coffee with God, or tea with God, or water with God, whatever you want to call it. But it's that time where you're just with the Lord. Right? Share with people what God has called you to do so that you're held accountable.
Because when we don't share, then God can speak and it can just fade away.
Write stuff down. Make sure that when God speaks to you, you write it down, that you're running it past people that you trust, right? If it's a big thing. But the most important thing I would say is to start off with those small moments and to realize that it's a process and it's progressive. You get progressively more and more obedient.
That's it.
As you see that like beautiful circles start to happen. Like God speaks, you're obedient, you're blessed. God speaks, you're obedient, you're blessed. And it just creates this desire to do it more and more. You know, I don't know if that makes sense, but that would be my one nugget of advice. Just start small and don't beat yourself up. You're not going to, it doesn't matter how obedient you are, you're not necessarily always going to be on an international stage ministering to tens of thousands of people. God has given to us our lot and our portion, and we need to be happy with doing what He's called us to do. And we're not always going to be on the center stage, changing the world. I think that's a misconception a lot of Christians have. God is building His church. He is changing the world. Yeah, He is saving people, and we are being used as His servants where He sees fit. And no matter how small or how big it may be perceived, this thing that we're doing, as long as it's being obedient to God, that's significant enough, if that makes sense.
Rolls, thank you. That's really fantastic. And the only thing I'll add to that is if you find it difficult to motivate yourself, grab a buddy. Do it with a friend. Yeah. And just say, hey, let's both do this. And then you've got someone to share what God says to you with, and B, you've got someone who's going to walk through the trenches with you and encourage you to keep going when you forget and fail. Yeah. So awesome. Totally. Rolls, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been such a blessing to chat together.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been good to be here.
It's been awesome. I hope you guys have been blessed as you've listened to this. And so we just pray as you go into the week that's ahead of you, God will speak to you and lead you in moments of obedience. And pray He would give you the grace and the courage to follow Him wherever He leads you. As always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. It'd be great. Share it with a friend. Chat it through with someone that you care about or you think might be blessed by it. It'd be great for us to be together cultivating this culture of obedience to the kingdom agenda. Thank you so much for being with us today. And until next week, ciao for now.
Cheers. Bye.